understand what happened in that jungle on May 2nd, 1968, you have to understand who Roy Benavidez was before it. Because almost nothing about his life up to that point suggested he was destined for anything extraordinary at all. Roy Perez Benavidez was born in 1935 in Cuero, Texas, to a Mexican-American father and a Yaqui Indian mother. He was orphaned by the age of 7, losing both parents to tuberculosis, and was raised afterward by relatives in a world defined by poverty and hard, unglamorous labor. He dropped out of school in the 7th grade to work in the fields alongside his family, picking cotton and sugar beets to help make ends meet. Growing up Mexican-American and Native American in rural South Texas in the 1940s meant navigating a world of segregated schools, limited economic opportunity, and a social hierarchy that offered young men like Benavidez very few paths upward. Farm labor was, for most of the families in his community, simply the expected future. Generation after generation, working the same fields under the same difficult conditions. There was nothing in that childhood that read like the beginning of a legend. By his teenage years, he was working long, punishing hours in the fields, and by most accounts, he was determined even then to find a way out of the cycle of poverty that had defined his family for generations. The military offered that path. Not glamour, not glory, just steady work and a sense of structure and purpose that his early life had been missing. He joined the Texas National Guard as a teenager and later enlisted in the U.S. Army, eventually earning a spot in the Army's elite special forces, the Green Berets. It was a grueling, exhausting path for a young man with a 7th grade education and a heavy Texas accent that some of his fellow soldiers openly mocked. Benavidez didn't care. He outworked almost everyone around him, driven by something deeper than ambition, a sense that he owed something to the country that had given his family, despite everything, a chance to build a life. Those who trained alongside him in the early years describe a young soldier who was rarely the most naturally gifted man in the room, but who simply refused to be outworked. He ran further, trained longer, and volunteered for harder assignments than almost anyone around him, a pattern that would define the rest of his career and ultimately his legacy. In 1965, during his first tour in Vietnam, Benavidez stepped on a landmine. The explosion very nearly killed him and left him with injuries doctors believed would end his military career for good. Damage to his back, so severe that some physicians told him he would never walk normally again, let alone return to combat. For over a year, Benavidez underwent brutal, grinding rehabilitation. Officially, he wasn't even supposed to be attempting to walk at that stage of his recovery. Unofficially, night after night, he snuck out of his hospital bed and forced himself in agonizing secret sessions against a wall to try to stand, then to shuffle, then eventually to walk. Fellow patients at the hospital later recalled hearing him grinding his teeth through the pain in the dark, refusing to call for help, refusing to let anyone see him fail. When doctors and Army evaluators finally examined him again, they were stunned. Against every medical expectation, Benavidez had willed himself back onto his feet. He didn't just want to walk again, he wanted to go back. Against the advice of doctors who told him he was pushing his luck, against the quiet disbelief of colleagues who assumed his career was over, Roy Benavidez fought his way back onto flight status and returned to Vietnam for a second tour in January 1968, assigned to a Studies and Observations Group, one of the most secretive and dangerous covert special forces units of the entire war, running deep reconnaissance and rescue missions into hostile, often unmapped territory along the Cambodian border. These units operated with a mortality rate far higher than conventional infantry formations. The men who volunteered for them understood, going in, that the missions they'd be running were often deniable, unofficial, and extraordinarily dangerous. Small teams inserted deep into enemy-controlled jungle with limited support and no guarantee of extraction if things went wrong. Nobody forced him back into that world. He chose it, twice, with a body that had already been broken once and rebuilt through sheer stubbornness alone. By the spring of 1968, Benavidez had settled into the rhythm of life at a special forces base near the Cambodian border, training, waiting, occasionally flying support for reconnaissance teams heading out into the jungle, always aware that any given mission could turn into exactly the kind of nightmare his fellow soldiers whispered about in quiet moments between operations. The border region was considered some of the most dangerous ground in the entire war, a shifting, contested no man's land, where American and Allied forces operated with limited support, deep inside territory that was, for all practical purposes, controlled by the North Vietnamese army. None of that would matter as much as what happened on the morning of May 2nd, 1968, a day that began as an ordinary Thursday at a special forces base and ended with Roy Benavidez being zipped into a body bag. He had already survived one impossible recovery. He had no idea a far greater one was still ahead of him. May 2nd, 1968. A 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team, a mix of American Green Berets and South Vietnamese and Montagnard soldiers, was inserted deep into enemy-held jungle near Loc Ninh, close to the Cambodian border, on a classified intelligence-gathering mission. These reconnaissance insertions were, by design, quiet and small. Success depended entirely on staying hidden. If a team like this was discovered, there was often little standing between them and an overwhelming enemy response, with reinforcement measured in hours rather than minutes. Almost immediately after landing, the team walked directly into a nightmare. They had been dropped, unknowingly, near a heavily fortified North Vietnamese army base camp. An enemy force numbering in the hundreds, dug in and waiting, vastly outnumbering the small reconnaissance team in both manpower and firepower. Within minutes, the 12-man team was surrounded and cut to pieces by overwhelming automatic weapons. Fire, mortars, and small arms fire from multiple directions at once. Casualties mounted almost instantly. The team's radio operator sent out a desperate distress call, but the situation on the ground was deteriorating so fast that rescue helicopters attempting to reach the landing zone were being driven back by intense anti-aircraft fire before they could even get close enough to land. Multiple helicopters attempted approach after approach in those early minutes, only to be forced back by walls of ground fire so intense that pilots described the landing zone as effectively unapproachable. For the men trapped below, each failed extraction attempt meant more time exposed, more time bleeding, more time watching the enemy tighten the circle around their shrinking position. Back at the Special Forces base, Roy Benavidez heard the distress call come in over the radio. He wasn't even assigned to that mission. He was scheduled to attend church that morning. But when he heard the desperation in the radio traffic, when he understood that a team of men, some of them his close friends, were dying in a jungle clearing with no way out, Benavidez didn't hesitate. He grabbed a medical bag and ran for the nearest helicopter. He carried no rifle into that fight. His only weapon, at first, was a knife strapped to his belt. He hadn't been ordered onto that helicopter. He climbed aboard it anyway, riding into a landing zone that other pilots were already refusing to approach because of how intense the ground fire had become. Aboard the aircraft, the pilot warned him plainly that the landing zone was effectively surrounded, that other helicopters had already been forced to turn back, and that setting down there might not be survivable at all. Benavidez's response, according to those who later reconstructed the events of that day, was simple. Get him as close as the aircraft could safely manage, and he would handle the rest on foot. As the helicopter neared the clearing, it couldn't even land. The fire from the ground was too heavy. Benavidez made the decision to jump from the hovering aircraft roughly 10 feet to the ground below, sprinting immediately into open fire to reach the surviving members of the trapped team. Within moments of hitting the ground, Benavidez was shot. a bullet tearing through his face, through his cheek and jaw. He kept moving. He reached the wounded and dying members of the team scattered across the clearing and began doing what he had trained his entire adult life to do: stabilizing wounds, redistributing ammunition, organizing what was left of the shattered unit into some kind of defensible perimeter, all while enemy fire tore through the clearing around him without pause. Of the 12 men on the original team, several were already dead by the time he reached them. Others were so severely wounded, they could no longer move under their own power, or even hold a weapon steadily enough to help defend the position. Benavidez moved between them in the open, exposed with every step, making split-second decisions about who needed treatment first, who could still fight, and who needed to be dragged toward whatever cover the terrain offered. He was hit again, and again. Over the following hours, historical accounts place the ordeal at approximately 6 hours of continuous, sustained combat. Benavidez was wounded repeatedly, shot multiple times through the body and legs, stabbed with a bayonet in hand-to-hand combat when an enemy soldier closed on him directly, and struck across the head and arms with a rifle butt in another close-quarters struggle he barely survived. At one point, he was shot through both legs and could no longer stand. He kept crawling, kept working, kept dragging wounded men toward whatever cover he could find. Survivors later described watching him move across open, fire-swept ground again and again, not because he was ordered to, and not because there was any tactical requirement that he personally make each trip, but because every time he saw another wounded man exposed in the open, something in him simply would not let that man be left there. He personally called in and directed airstrikes and artillery support onto positions dangerously close to his own location, accepting enormous personal risk to relieve pressure on the survivors around him. Coordinating fire support that close to your own position is an extraordinarily dangerous task under the best of circumstances. Done here, wounded, under direct fire, with radio equipment that was itself damaged during the fighting. It was an act that required both extraordinary composure and extraordinary risk tolerance. When a resupply helicopter finally managed to get close enough to attempt an extraction, Benavidez organized the loading of the wounded and the dead onto the aircraft under continuous fire, making trip after trip across open ground, exposed each time, to carry or drag another man to the helicopter. The first extraction helicopter that attempted to land was so heavily damaged by enemy fire that its pilot was killed and the aircraft crashed. Benavidez, already wounded multiple times over, pulled survivors from the wreckage and continued organizing the defense of the landing zone, refusing to stop even as his own body was failing beneath him. By the time a second helicopter finally managed to extract the survivors, Roy Benavidez had been wounded so many times, doctors would later count 37 separate individual wounds across his body. Gunshot wounds, bayonet wounds, shrapnel wounds, and blunt trauma. He was disemboweled, his intestines exposed, and had lost such an overwhelming amount of blood that by the time he reached the base, he was, for all practical purposes, unresponsive. He had personally saved the lives of at least 8 men that day, and quite likely more, in an action that military historians would later call one of the most extraordinary single acts of valor of the entire Vietnam War. But at the base, the medical staff receiving him looked at what remained of his body and reached a devastating conclusion. They believed he was already dead. They zipped him into a body bag. The legend of the ghost soldier hadn't started yet. It was about to. At the base field hospital, in the chaos of processing an overwhelming number of casualties from that single, catastrophic mission, Roy Benavidez's body, covered in wounds, unconscious, and unresponsive, was placed into a body bag alongside the confirmed dead. A doctor, moving quickly through the triage line, examined him and pronounced him dead. The bag began to be zipped closed, and then, according to the accounts of the men present that day, Roy Benavidez, somehow, impossibly, through wounds that should have killed almost any human being, regained just enough consciousness to realize what was happening to him. Unable to speak because of the gunshot wound through his jaw, unable to move his ruined body enough to fight his way out, Benavidez did the only thing he had left. He spat in the doctor's face. It was, by every account, an act of pure, defiant will. A dying man's last possible signal that he was still, somehow, alive. The doctor recoiled, looked again, and realized the man he had just pronounced dead was still breathing. Benavidez was rushed into emergency surgery. He survived. The recovery that followed was, in its own way, nearly as extraordinary as the battle itself. Months of surgeries, of rebuilding a body that had absorbed 37 individual wounds, of the same brutal willpower he had used years earlier to force himself to walk again after his landmine injury. He would carry the physical scars and the physical limitations of that day for the rest of his life. Friends and family who visited him during his recovery described a man who, even wrapped in bandages and unable to speak clearly because of his jaw wound, was already asking about the men he'd pulled out of that clearing, wanting to know who had survived, who hadn't, and whether their families had been told. For his actions on May 2nd, 1968, Roy Benavidez's chain of command recommended him for the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest award for valor. But there was a problem. Regulations at the time required either 2 eyewitnesses to corroborate an action of that magnitude, or, in some circumstances, a formal statement from the recipient himself describing precisely what had happened. Almost everyone who had witnessed the full scope of what Benavidez had done that day was dead. For years, his nomination stalled in bureaucratic limbo, a casualty of paperwork and process as much as anything else, while Benavidez continued to serve out his career largely unrecognized for the full scale of what he had survived and accomplished. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross in the meantime, itself a significant honor, the second highest award for valor in the Army. But those who knew the full details of that day always believed it fell short of what the action actually warranted. It would take over a decade, and the eventual, painstaking gathering of surviving witness testimony, including from a soldier named Brian O'Connor, who had been on the ground that day, and whose account finally provided the corroboration the process required, before the case was fully reconsidered. O'Connor, it turned out, had survived the battle and had spent years afterward, from his own hospital bed and beyond, trying to make sure the record was set straight, refusing to let the story simply fade into an unresolved file somewhere in the Army's archives. For years, O'Connor had been presumed dead by many who knew of the battle, his own fate uncertain in the chaos of the aftermath. When he was eventually located, alive, in the late 1970s, his detailed, first-hand account of what Benavidez had done that day became the missing piece the review board needed. It was, in its own quiet way, a second act of loyalty completing the first. One soldier, years later, still fighting to make sure another soldier's sacrifice was properly recognized. In 1981, 13 years after that 6-hour battle in a Cambodian border jungle, President Ronald Reagan presented Roy Benavidez with the Medal of Honor at a White House ceremony. Reagan, reading a summary of Benavidez's actions to the assembled press afterward, reportedly turned to the reporters present and said that if the account they had just heard had been submitted as a movie script, veteran military officers would have rejected it as too unrealistic to be believable. By that point, Benavidez had already retired from active duty, his body no longer capable of sustaining the physical demands of the Special Forces career he'd fought so hard to reclaim after his first injury. Standing at the White House in a formal uniform rather than jungle fatigues, 13 years removed from the mud and blood of that clearing, he reportedly remained characteristically modest about the entire event. insisting repeatedly that the real heroes were the men who hadn't come home at all. It wasn't fiction. It was a Thursday morning in May, and one man who wasn't even supposed to be on that helicopter. Roy Benavidez spent much of the rest of his life speaking to school children, veterans, and civic groups across the country. Not about glory, but about the value of education, hard work, and service, drawing directly from his own beginnings as a 7th-grade dropout picking cotton in Texas. He often told young audiences that his story wasn't really about combat at all. It was about refusing to accept the limits other people tried to place on you, whether that was a doctor telling him he'd never walk again, or a system that told a poor Mexican-American kid from South Texas what he was and wasn't capable of becoming. He was fiercely proud of his Mexican-American and Native American heritage, and became, particularly within Latino and veteran communities, a deeply significant symbol of courage and sacrifice, too often overlooked in the broader telling of American military history. He died in 1998, still carrying the physical toll of that day 30 years earlier. His body, by his own account, never fully free of pain from the wounds he'd absorbed in that jungle clearing. Today, his story is memorialized in Texas. A U.S. Navy ship bears his name, along with schools, highways, and a statue in his hometown. But for decades after that battle, his name was known mostly within Special Forces circles and Latino veteran communities, largely absent from the broader popular memory of the Vietnam War that so often centered other stories instead. He wasn't erased by accident. He was overlooked by the slow, grinding indifference of bureaucracy, by the passage of time, and by a country that, in the aftermath of Vietnam, was often reluctant to examine its own war stories closely at all, heroic or otherwise. In recent years, that has slowly begun to change. Military historians, veterans organizations, and Latino advocacy groups have worked to bring Benavidez's story to a wider audience, arguing that his account belongs alongside the most famous acts of heroism in American military history, not in a footnote, but in the main text. Documentaries, books, and renewed public ceremonies in his honor have tried to close the gap between what he actually did in that jungle clearing and how few people, for decades, ever learned his name. It remains, even now, an uphill effort, a reminder of how easily even the most extraordinary stories can slip through the cracks of official process, public attention, and the simple passage of time, unless someone deliberately chooses to keep telling them. Those who knew Benavidez personally often said the same thing about him, that despite everything he had endured, despite 37 wounds and 13 years of waiting for recognition and a lifetime of chronic pain, he never spoke about that day with bitterness. He spoke about it, when he spoke about it at all, as simply the moment he had done the job he'd trained for, nothing more, nothing less. The men he'd carried out of that clearing became, for the rest of his life, the measure of what the day had actually meant to him, far more than any medal ever could be. They called him dead once, and he proved them wrong with his own defiance. They nearly let his story die a second time, not with bullets, but with paperwork and silence. Roy Benavidez survived 37 wounds in a jungle clearing most Americans have never heard of. The least we can do is make sure his name survives too. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, there are more incredible true stories waiting on History Reborn. New cinematic documentaries every week. Subscribe so you never miss the untold stories that shaped our world.